and the protocols internationally came out after the Human Rights Declaration was enacted. And they happened in 51 and again in 67. It takes a long time for some of this to happen. The United States subscribed to that, and we have on our books an asylum law that says they have the right to seek asylum if blah, blah, blah. So, and the protocols are there for that. And we're going to talk to you a little bit now about what is happening on the border from the perspective we have. But I want that general idea in terms of why they're coming. They're coming because they have arisen, if you want to use that term. They are aware that they are human beings who have a right to live. They have a right not to be slaughtered. They have a right for their children to have an education, to have health care. And if you think about it, there is a connection between this country and those folks. And we have had that connection for a long time, because we have had those folks in our country as we built the empire with Indians, Native people, African Americans, anybody that was different than the European Anglo that came here. And we kept pushing, and we keep pushing. And so that, as we talk about it, is a big task in terms of thinking, how do you change the mindset of a nation that has been convinced that other people are an enemy? How do you convince that? How do you change people that something different can happen from here? And we're going to talk about some of that now. So Sonny Robinson is going to take over.
Thank you, Jeanne, for the review of history, the overview, the framework from which we're now going to try to look at some of the specifics of the immigration situation that we all now face. I apologize for speaking from behind you, but I need to be able to do that so I can see the computer screen to see what we're doing. So as you know, we posed 3 questions to try to look at. Why are so many people seeking asylum? What is our government's response? And what is or could be our U.S. people's response to that migration? So we went to the border. Jeanne and I both had the opportunity to go to the School of the Americas Encuentro gathering conference at the border in both 2017 and 2018. And here we are on the Sunday morning session at the border, 2018. That's what the wall in Nogales, Arizona, separating Nogales, Arizona from Nogales, Mexico looked like. And we see all the wonderful young people who are so deeply involved in School of the Americas work, acknowledging presente, the names of people who tried to cross the border and who did not make it. So, School of the Americas, I think probably most people here have a good sense of it. I'll just do a quick review. So the School of the Americas is the U.S. military training site at Fort Benning, Georgia. Prior to 1984, they'd been located in the Canal Zone, but then moved to the U.S. Its goal is to unify and train the armies of Latin America and the United States so that they can work together. In doing that, they then were the training source for many of the very major massacres and genocides that happened in Central America, Latin America in the 80s and beyond that, before that and beyond that. There was much protest around the School of the Americas, so in 2001, it changed its name to the Western Hemispheric Institution for National Security Cooperation, which they think is a great idea, which I think is a terrible idea, because it just makes all the militaries of the Americas subject to the control and training of the U.S. their policies have remained unchanged. And the end point, of course, being that violence and war are what create the refugees. They are here because the U.S. was there. Obviously, the goal is close the School of the Americas. We used to know a great deal about who specifically was being trained and in what way at the School of the Americas. We no longer know those specifics very much. For example, we have no idea how much School of the Americas might be involved in the training of the Customs and Border Patrol. So here's the border, just to really try to get you be there. So the wall in Nogales between Arizona and Mexico was built in the 1990s. It's about 30 feet high. It's the steel slat framework, then with solid metal plates on the top. It's about 30 feet high. And that grassy area that you see on the left in front of the fence is where the gathering on Saturday and Sunday at the Encuentro happens. When you look on the right, you see that our fine military has added some additional barriers. The shiny steel stuff along the lower part of the fence is now a chicken wire kind of mesh, so that the opportunity for human contact through the fence is greatly limited. And you also see they built a nice metal pen, making it much more difficult to gather in the area in front of the fence where we usually gathered. And you also see they laid down all this lumpy, sharp concrete, so it's very hard to walk on. That was November 2018. Here we are now. In February, March 2019. Those are your tax dollars at work being put up by U.S. soldiers with 6 coils of concertina wire being put along the fence from top to bottom, so that if you did happen to get over the fence, you then still had to jump clear of all of that concertina wire. And even since we got those pictures within the last month or so, the whole area in front of the fence, which already had the extra barrier, now also has concertina wire all down it, so that absolutely the back and forth that happened even at the Encuentro from one side to the other is no longer possible because of having to reach through the concertina wire. This is absolutely downtown Nogales. So we don't stop with fences and concertina wire. We also have surveillance towers that operate 24/7, heat detection, video face recognition, scattered throughout the town and scattered all along the wall. It is the same company that makes the surveillance towers used to monitor the Palestinians so they don't escape from the Palestinian areas in Israel. And also a great deal of use of helicopters. For the whole time we were there, helicopters flying around. And it's really important to let it register that it's not just the border or Mexico we're militarizing. We're militarizing the U.S. We are all as surveyed when we gather there as the Mexicans might be. So what's our current immigration situation in the U.S.? As many people know, the number of people living without required documentation in the U.S. has actually decreased over the last 10 years. What the current figures are, I'm not quite sure. They're not as readily available as they were. But in 2016, we had more than 12 million, but by 2016, that had gone down to 10.7 million. Who are these people who are living here? They are mostly now long-term residents, 66% having been here more than 10 years, with the median number of years here being 14.4. And most of the children who are living here with undocumented parents were in fact born here in the United States. So what are some of the major immigration issues we want to take a look at? And one of the things we like to do in our presentations, we hear about these things bit by bit in the news media. So one of the things we're trying to do is bring the issues together so you see how they relate. So we have temporary protective status with at least 300,000 people who are TPS recipients in the United States at this point in time. They come from a number of African countries like Somalia, South Sudan, Libya, but we were concentrating today really on the Central American connections. And people came and got temporary protective status after some catastrophe in their country, whether that was a hurricane, an earthquake, or war situations. The Trump administration is really concentrating on ending TPS for Nicaraguans, Salvadorans, Haitians, and Hondurans. That, in fact, was put into place, ending TPS, meaning required deportation, by the Trump administration, but it has been temporarily halted by some of the excellent work that's gone on in the federal courts. However, there is no permanent safety or pathway to citizenship, in fact, in front of the Congress at this point in time to try to resolve the situation for those 300,000 plus people. Though I believe there are, in fact, in the new Democratic House, some people starting to think about how we end temporary protective status and create a pathway to citizenship for these folks. Another issue we hear about is DACA. Now, I think most of us think DACA is a wonderful thing, and I think DACA is a wonderful thing. But it's really important to understand that it's very limited, and it is a merit-based piece of allowed immigration. It does not extend to all youth who are in this country with their undocumented parents. So there is, at present, there is no, again, no permanent safety or pathway to citizenship for the more than 800,000 young people who are DACA recipients at this point in time. Those who are here are able still to apply and renew their status for 2 years additionally. One of the biggest problems happening with DACA at the moment is even young people who are eligible for DACA are not applying for DACA because they know they will be outing their parents by doing so, and they are not willing to take that risk. Some of the criteria you have to meet DACA, you have to have been here continuously for 4 years, and you have to be able to prove you've been here continuously. No going home for your grandmother's funeral or your brother's wedding or anything like that. You have to pass a background check. You have to have a high school diploma. You have to have been admitted to college. You have to pass a medical exam. And this being the United States, you have to pay a fee. It is possible to move from that conditional DACA to permanent residence, but not citizenship. Again, you have to prove your continuous residence, that you can read, write, speak English, that you understand U.S. history and government. You have to again pass a background check. You have to pay another fee. And then in fact, you have to demonstrate that you meet one of 3 principal criteria. Having served 2 years in the U.S. military, completed college or at least 2 years beyond a bachelor's or higher degree, and you have to have been employed for at least 3 years. Now, those are a lot of criteria and very hard in this economy for many young people to be able to meet. So DACA, while good, is limited and it's a merit-based system. One of the wonderful groups of young people we had a chance to meet with when we were at the border is this group from Oakland, California. They call themselves 67 Sueños. Sueños being the Spanish word for dreams. And what they point out is 67% of the young people who are here with undocumented parents are not eligible for DACA. So again, we have to greatly expand that legislation to create safety for all of those young people. Another of the immigration situations currently in operation is Operation Streamline, which is the way in which the U.S. government, the Border Patrol, in fact, reaches out and apprehends people, arrests them, detains them, and then moves them along after detention to a criminal conviction. It's important to understand that being undocumented in this country is a civil offense and is a civil misdemeanor. But crossing the border has now been declared a criminal offense, not a civil offense. A first apprehension after a first illegal crossing the border is a misdemeanor, often gives you the time served, which could be from 1 to 6 months, and then a second illegal re-entry makes you a felon, a criminal felon, and you can very often acquire additional prison time. 51% of all federal crimes in the country at this point in time are immigration related. If people are not detained, they are either deported or they might be released if their asylum claim has been found initially valid. And it's the whole criminal prosecution being brought to court in groups of 70, shackled together in groups of 7 or 8, tried summarily. All of those criminal court proceedings take place before someone gets to immigration court and has the opportunity to present their asylum claim. This is Eloy Federal for-profit detention center out in the desert about 60 miles north of Tucson. It is a huge facility. It is for both men and women. And this is a detention facility that is for single adults. This is not one of the detention facilities that in fact incorporates children also. Part of going to the encuentro is always a demonstration at the gates of Eloy, which has the reputation for being one of the worst, most brutal, less responsive of the detention center. And the encuentro is represented here by many of the very wonderful youth leaders who are so much a part of School of the Americas Watch work. Many of these young people are either undocumented or DACA recipients, nevertheless doing this work. And again, we gather at the border as part of the vigil to acknowledge all those people who have died in their attempt to enter the country, or they are people who their bodies have been found, but they've never been identified, so that is what desconocido means, the unidentified. So what's our current situation? Okay, so really looking in the moment in 2019, not just some of the bigger areas of problems. The number of people historically coming to the US had been Mexicans coming from Mexico. The number of Mexican arrivals has actually decreased over the last years, with a huge increase in the arrivals of people coming from Central America, where the gang and military violence are increasing and people are literally fleeing for their lives. Gangs will, if the gangs do not succeed in drawing one person in a family into the gang, they then threaten the entire family, and so ultimately the entire family, including children, end up fleeing. People are also fleeing the impact of climate change, incredible reoccurring droughts in Central America, crop failures, and poverty. You see that in 2018, the number of arrivals, apprehensions in this case, increased greatly from in the 30,000s to the 60,000s. And then we see in March of this year, more than 100,000 people were apprehended at the border. Trump says we're full. I raised the question, we're not a full country. Why don't we just welcome these people to come and live here? There is still, it certainly takes economic effort, but there is still plenty of room in this country for people who are exercising their human rights, as Jeanne talked about, and coming here. Here's a graph that shows you some of the changing figures in who's coming, with the dark brown at the top being the people who are family units, so parents and children coming together. And you see as we go from October of 2018 to February of this year, the number of family units arriving has greatly increased. So let's look a few minutes at the children and the children's detention issues very specifically. We see unaccompanied minors coming, and we also see children coming with their families. And without anyone knowing very clearly anymore the numbers, children are still being separated from their parents. The Flores case has been used in the judicial system to limit the detention of children to 20 days max. But there are efforts from the Trump administration, from the so-called Department of Justice, that are currently trying to either have the limits of the Flores case thrown out or extended. The people who staff the children's detention facilities do not have to meet any of the requirements that any of the states require for providing service for children. So for example, if the Department of Children and Families here in Massachusetts required many levels of reference and background check, none of that is required in the children's detention facilities. The children are not permitted to touch each other, and no staff person is permitted to touch a child. So no hugging and no comforting. This is the Tornillo detention facility in Tornillo, Texas, where you probably followed along through the news. There were protests, very effective protests, so that this camp was shut down in December of last year. However, the children that were remaining in detention at Tornillo, again, likely unaccompanied minors, were then moved to Homestead, Florida, where the facility in Homestead, next door to a military base, has been being increased till it's now more, it houses now more than 3,000 youth. All of whom assumedly can only be kept there 20 days and are moving forward into the country to join their parents or some other relative somewhere else in the country. I bring you a couple of the children that we all may have heard something about. Jacqueline Call McKean was the 7-year-old from Guatemala who died in Customs and Border Control in December of last year after becoming ill and receiving inadequate medical attention. And similarly, Felipe Gomez Alonso, an 8-year-old also from Guatemala, and from 2 of the areas of Guatemala greatly affected by both gang violence and crop failure, I would say, who also died in border